Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. It's our great pleasure to be joined this evening by Pavel Bychkov of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who will be speaking on the subject of the symbolic aspects of medieval alchemy's manuscripts. Pavel is a medievalist and junior researcher at the Institute of World History at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and also researches for the Center for Historical Anthropology. Since 2022, he has been the editor of the Electronic, Scientific and Educational Journal History, and holds an MA and BA in history from the Russian State University in Moscow. He's written several articles since 2020 on subjects such as the role of the illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady of Hertogenbosch in the 13th to 16th centuries, the uses of body metaphor in describing social in Christine de Pizan's The Book of Body Politic, conceptualizing the French kingdom of the 14th to 15th centuries, the Amazon myth in Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies, and corporations and everyday life of the Hertogenbosch in the 14th to 15th centuries. He also delivered a fantastic video essay for IHSHG entitled Soviet Medievalism, How Russians Viewed the Middle Ages in the 20th Century. His key research interests include the history of France and England in the 14th to 16th centuries, intellectual and cognitive history, alchemy, the history of the body and corporeality, and medievalism and the reception of the Middle Ages. Pavel, it's great to have you with us this evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm very humbled by this introduction. Should I begin?
Absolutely, yes, please do.
Today's theme is pretty complex, but I hope that I'll tell something interesting to the viewers and to Peter. It's the symbolic aspects of medieval alchemical manuscripts. At first, I would say that I wouldn't be pretending that I can explain the whole theme, because there are plenty of literature written on this subject, but I will touch on some aspects of visual representation in medieval alchemy, and I would also try to dig into the quite exotic world of Russian historiography on the subject, which might be not so common for viewers in English-speaking public. So at first I would run over the literature that is written on it. Also, there are plenty of European, British and French and American authors. There are also quite plenty of figures in Russian historiography that were interested in alchemy, and I should explain that this interest was very specific, because in Soviet historiography the main focuses were on social history, on political history, and the Middle Ages itself was a quite exotic theme to research, but even to go deep into the religious or mysticism of this era, it would be considered bizarre, strange, and not very mainstream, I would say. So it attracted the people who would think very specifically, that would see something in this theme that they would like to research. And first, I should say about two controversial figures. This is Vadim Rabinovich, who wrote a quite big study on alchemy in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. There he would try to see how the alchemists viewed the world, how they would think, and he was pretty accepted by the scientific community, but the other figure that were more marginalized, as the alchemy itself was viewed in Soviet culture, was Evgeny Golovin. Maybe you might know his apprentice, his student, Alexander Dugin, self-proclaimed philosopher, pretty controversial too. And Evgeny Golovin viewed alchemy as this opposing philosophy against Soviet government, Soviet culture, that it was so ancient and so not productive, that it would that the study of the alchemy would provide some counterculture in itself. to the mainstream Soviet thought. Although these are not historians and they didn't study these sources as Golovin wasn't a scientist at all. Rabinovich was more a philosopher, an essayist, than a historian, than a researcher and a scholar. So I would leave this apart and would move on to the more appreciated by historians, scientists. Maybe some would know the name of the Aaron Gurevich. He was a quite big figure in Russian medieval studies, and he studied the mental history, the history of thought, of the worldview of medieval people. His student Dmitry Haritanovich wrote a PhD thesis on the subject of craft recipes, because he was studying before he became historian. He was studying metals and chemistry, and then he drove to his history and history of thought. And so he started to study medieval recipes and discovered that behind these recipes, behind these instructions, there stood some mythical beliefs that even could be seen in these documents of this era. So this is a very interesting view on such sources, just not as some instructions as we see it now, but as some narrative in itself in these recipes. So these are some figures that sparked interest in the Russian history and science to alchemy, and that I would base my presentation on. Moving on, I should say that the illustrations and the illuminated manuscripts in alchemy appeared very late in 12th and 13th, even 14th century. Mostly these were just verbal, these were just texts in itself, and only consisted a small part of schemes, of spreadsheets, diagrams, and so on, as we see it here. And this is more closer to the Pythagorean tradition, to the Neoplatonic tradition, more close to the philosophy of ancient Greece and their systems and their views on the nature, on the cosmic structure, and so on. And I would not be considering this as my theme today. And also I would not talk about more material pictures, like pictures of instruments and so on. I would be just viewing the symbolic visualization of some concepts in alchemy. And it appeared very late, in the late 14th, in the 15th century, you could find first illustrations in these manuscripts. And before we go into it, we should say that mostly the worldview in Middle Ages would be symbolic, and it's not just some science that we're seeing in these manuscripts. It's more profound, more complex. I'm not sure how to put it, because it's it's a very difficult subject to discuss, but there is a French historian, Michel Pastoureau, who wrote a great book, Symbolical Middle Ages. I don't know the correct name in English, but I'm sure you can find it, that discussed this worldview in Middle Ages, that everything that happened, everything that could be seen by medieval man could be viewed as a symbol of something else. So it's not just a material object, it's a sign that God or some forces are given a man, and it plays all the way back to. So the symbol is something that works on different levels. There is the literal meaning, there is the symbolical meaning, and there could be multiple symbolical meanings of this object. As an example, I would bring up maybe a known figure in Christian iconography. It's a pelican who's feeding his own children. In different bestiaries, in different books and encyclopedias in Middle Ages, that would be seen as the symbol of the Christ who is feeding his own children with his own flesh and blood. We don't know where this legend comes from, maybe from the way that pelicans feed their children, bringing in their mouth fish and so on, and that would transfer into this quite disturbing image. But of course, this is the symbol of Christ, who is feeding with his own flesh and blood us, the people, to be saved. And the same image could be seen in medieval alchemists' treatises, in works of medieval alchemists, or similar images like this from Aurora Consurgens, where men are also fed by some female figure. And we could say that if we see this image of pelican who is feeding his children, that would mean that it is Christ. And Christ in alchemy is the symbol of lapis philosophorum, philosopher's stone, which we all know through the pop culture. But we can't be sure that it's really this meaning, because we don't have the key, we don't have the transcript of many of the pictures that we see in alchemist manuscripts. It also can just symbolize something from the material world, like this retort that I put in the middle, that resembled by its form a pelican. So it could be something very, very profound, like philosopher's stone, which is the goal of the alchemist's activities, or it could be just something very mundane, like this instrument that could be found in alchemist's lab. We're dealing with something that is not quite clear for us, that is that has many layers of meaning, and we're not when we see some picture, we're not sure what is meant by this image. And that's what's important to remember when we're going through it. Moving on, also what is playing a huge role in this imagery is the oppositions. It's common in religious world and in myths and so on that there are multiple binaries in the narrative. So there is right and left, there is female and male, and of course in every religion there is good and bad. And that transfers also to alchemy, where these oppositions, they interact in some way, and through their interaction we have the process that is going on in the mind of an alchemist and in our world itself. For example, and these oppositions, these different forces that battle in these pictures, there are also some symbols. For example, here we see a sun and a moon that are battling, and as we see it in these themes, these elements, they transfer through the ages. This is the 15th century or 16th century, and it even goes on into 17th and 18th century, and we see the same pictures over and over, and it repeats itself. So in alchemy, the main goal, as I said, is to get a philosopher's stone. And as we all know, the philosopher's stone is needed to transmute, to transform metals into gold. And after the Middle Ages, in the late 17th century and the 18th century, there would be a belief that alchemists are very materialistic people who would like to enrich themselves through this process. But as many studies in the 20th century has shown, that it's not the initial goal itself. Maybe when it was in when it existed in modern day, in modern world, like in 19th century, alchemy would be seen as this quite materialistic it's quite materialistic enterprise. I can't find the word for it, but initially the goal was to obtain gold, but the gold was seen as some ideal. It was the perfect metal. It was something from the sky realm, something from the spiritual realm, because as we see in these miniatures, gold is represented by the sun, and the sun is what gives us life. And there is a quite beautiful metaphor that in these sources, that the sun gives us the light, and then the light is transformed into gold in the veins of the world, like and the gold flows in the veins of this earth, like blood flows in our bodies. So gold is seen as something perfect that that could not just enrich man, but that could transform the world itself. And here we come to the goal of the alchemy itself. The goal of the alchemy itself is to marry these oppositions, to destroy the conflict in the world that is going, to destroy death, and to destroy entropy by turning everything into something perfect, which is not touched by rust, which does not corrode, which does not die. So the way of the alchemists the way of the alchemist is to become like a god, become godlike, and to destroy death and sin in this world, and to transform it to something beautiful. As I said, here we see the sun, which represents the gold, and the moon. The moon is mostly represents silver, but also these figures, like the king and the queen, the man and the woman, sometimes represent sulfur and mercury, the two core elements that which is believed by alchemists could, by conjunction, by marrying to themselves, could produce the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. This whole process of marrying these oppositions is called opus magnum, the great deal, the great process. And that's what alchemy is all about. And as I said previously about talking about the pelican, a lot of religious imagery could be seen in works of alchemists, and sometimes this Christian imagery is mixed up with different traditions like Greek imagery or even some kind of Gnostic imagery, pagan imagery. And this begs the question how alchemy and its symbols are correlating with Christianity. Is it orthodox or is it heresy? Is it some kind of religion in its own? And that's a very interesting question in itself. For example, here we see from Aurora Consurgens, the 15th century book of alchemist's recipes. Here we see the Hermaphroditus, who could be seen as pagan god in itself, but at the same time, this is the Hermaphroditus is the man and the woman in the same time, but also it could be interpreted as a Christian imagery if you dig deep enough into theology of Christianity, into Hebrew theology. There is the belief that before creating Eve, Adam had woman nature in himself, which was just took away by God and by creating the woman from his rib. So this is also a myth that we can find in the works of Plato. In his dialogues, there is a myth that before men were divided into men and women, there were androgynes, androgens. Sorry if I pronounce it not correctly. Some kind of monsters which were two bodies tied together, and Plato explains the myth, this myth as a symbol of our love to other people, that if we're alone, we suffer because we were divided in itself. So here it is. There are multiple layers there. The Neoplatonism, there is the Christianity, and there is the alchemist symbols, and we can't really draw the line where this symbols, where the imagery ends and begins the Christian beliefs, and we can't really tell what is orthodox, what is not orthodox. Are alchemists just using these religious symbols like Christ in their works to represent something else? For example, the elements and the steps of their process, or is it deeply religious art? Is it deeply religious craft for them? Because there is the belief that the transmutation of metals couldn't be carried on if alchemists were not prepared for it. If they're not perfect in themselves, they couldn't make the world better if their inner alchemy isn't working, if they're the same sinful man. So moving on, as I said, apart from the Christian imagery, there are a lot of very strange imagery that we couldn't find anywhere else in medieval world, just in these sources in itself. There is the hermaphrodite on the right, from Buch der Heiligen Dreifaltigkeit. This is the Book of Holy Trinity. This is an alchemist work that consists a lot of not very Christian imagery. There are the traditional symbols that are common in Christianity, like Trinity, Christ, Virgin Mary, and so on. But also there are some symbols that definitely aren't in the mythology of Christians. Another element apart from Hermaphroditus, which symbolizes the Philosopher's Stone itself, because he has conjoined the two forces, the female and male, the sulfur and the mercury. Apart from him, also a symbol of Philosopher's Stone is Ouroboros, is the snake that eats its own tail. It's also a quite ancient, even pre-Christian, maybe pre-Roman symbol that could be found in Scandinavian mythology, as you know, Jormungand, who encircles the earth. It could be found in Greek sources of Hellenistic period. And also there are multiple images, like from Rosarium Philosophorum, it's on the left, where we see a coitus, marriage of this sulfur and mercury, and it reminds us of some traditions of pagan religions like hierogamy, the sacral marriage of the priests or priestess with the other participant, which symbolizes the marriage of some goddess or god with its devoted believers. And all this strange imagery even provoked Carl Gustav Jung, a psychiatrist and psychologist famously known, to consider alchemy a vessel that just transferred this ancient pagan and Gnostic knowledge to the modern era. And he viewed it as some secret knowledge that were transferred from teachers to their apprentices. And I don't think that's the case, because even if we find a lot of imagery that is similar to pre-Christian symbols, I don't think that they bear the same meaning as there were in pre-Christian era in Roman Empire, in ancient East. I think that symbols may stay because they tend to be prevalent in our culture, but the meaning of the symbols can change with time. So I don't think that is the case, that alchemists were really pagan or Gnostic, or were considered some kind of heresy on unorthodox believers. And as an example of this, as an argument for my thesis, I would look over the symbol of the snake. We already have seen the dragon, the Ouroboros, the snake that bites its tail, but there are also other snakes and alchemy sources. This is more late source, but I couldn't find the picture of the symbol that you all know. This is nowadays it's a symbol of medicine, the pole that is encircled by a snake, but initially it was the symbol of Apollon, because he was in very interesting relations with the snake, with the dragons. He was just like St. George, a warrior who conquered a dragon. But also in Christian iconography, we can remember other snake, which is the snake from the Eden Garden. And so we could say that in Christianity, a snake is something evil. It's not it's not strange, because during the evolution, we the apes were the enemies of the snakes. This is something that could kill us in any given day. So we adapted, not adapted, but we made up this myth about the dragon that should be killed, that should be conquered. But my idea is that it's not that clear, because even in Bible, even in Old Testament, a snake could be seen as something good. And what is interesting in Christianity, that symbols and that imagery is not static. It's not something very simple. It's always very complex, just like Holy Trinity, for example. It's something that could be interpreted in different ways, and it's quite profound in some way. So there is other snake that appears in the book Numbers, not in Genesis, but the third book of the Old Testament. And it is the theme, that is the moment when Moses is leading the Hebrews from the Egypt, and they were bitten by snakes in the desert. So the God says to rise a pole and to crucify a snake on the pole, and everyone who venerates it, everyone who bows to it, is cured from this poison, and snakes couldn't bite him. That's a very interesting theme, because after the New Testament, after the spread of Christianity, this episode is interpreted as the Christ itself. And sometimes this pole that we see is depicted as a cross, which a snake is crucified on. So we can say that snake is always something bad. There are different snakes, and the context of this image could be different. For example, it could be a dragon from the Revelation, which is obviously bad. It could be a snake from Genesis, which also is the protagonist of the story, which is the devil itself. Or it could be snake, which represents Christ, a snake on the cross. And I think that's a good example of what symbol really is in the view of alchemists. It's something very multi-layered, and it could mean anything. If we don't have the key to interpret it, it's difficult to interpret if we don't know all the meanings of this object, of this animal, of this color, on so on. And here I placed a very peculiar dragon from the Ripley scroll. It's quite interesting source. Here are some more images, and you can look it up on the Google Art. I think there is the pictures in quite good resolution, and with the text, which you could read with the commentary from specialists. And this Ripley manuscript looks also very bizarre, very strange to us. There are dragons, there are fountains, there is some stranger who looks up to all this construction. It's all written on one paper, on one scroll. And here I would point out that there is a question if all this imagery is so deep, is so mysterious. And here I should say that a lot of what medieval people consider as something mundane and common to them, after the Middle Ages, in the modern era, would be viewed as something very occult, something very mystic in itself. We could point an obvious example of it. It's the masonry, which in Middle Ages was just about building stuff, wasn't that tied up with some religious or philosophical views. But in the 16th, late 16th, 17th century, it became something very esoteric in itself. And nowadays, even it continues to amaze people. What's going behind the closed doors? What is this all rituals and imagery? But in Middle Ages, all these rituals and the initiation and the apprentices, it all was quite functional, not to give any secrets of their craft, not to make not to make everything public, not to give out opportunities to enrich themselves. That was not a capitalistic society. It was a feudal society that tried to keep monopoly in some field. And so I would argue that alchemists can be seen in the same way. All this complex imagery, all the symbols, is just to keep the secret inside this community, not to give it up. But as in any craft, as I think, there is an element of spirituality. For example, here we see the stranger. Some scientists guess that it's Ripley itself who made this manuscript, who is looking up and who is like revealing some secret in itself. So, but it's not an alchemy wouldn't be a religion in itself. It's just a spiritual practice that alchemists would try to persuade, try to live alone and to better themselves. And I think that's not just in alchemy, it's in all crafts. In Middle Ages, it could be seen like a spiritual practice in itself. It's in monasteries, it's in everyday life. So that's what I wanted to say. Maybe I forgot something, but I hope that it will come out with the questions and the discussion after my presentation.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Pavel. That was a really fascinating discussion. It's incredible to see just sort of how, with a lot of these images, they seem initially quite straightforward enough, but then as you dive into it, there's so much kind of oddness and complexity and things maybe not quite appearing as they are initially. That's really fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I wanted to initially dive into perhaps the methodology for actually deciphering the symbolism of these manuscripts. As I appreciate that you said earlier that they don't necessarily have a kind of strict guide to what each symbol necessarily means. I appreciate that perhaps with some of them, it's fairly evident. You can kind of draw good conclusions. But out of curiosity, how do you actually sort of go about trying to pick apart the meanings of kind of symbols in these manuscripts, especially when it's perhaps not immediately obvious what exactly they're after?
I think the key is in different spheres of medieval thought. For example, there is a strong parallels in medieval alchemy and medieval astrology. Every planet is associated, and it's written quite obviously in the sources, is associated with some metal. For example, not only gold and silver are associated with moon and sun, but also like Mercury, and it's in English it's even left, I guess. Yes, the Mercury is the planet and also an element, a chemical element. For example, iron is Mars, as I remember, and so on. So there are some parallels with the astrology, and even we could argue that alchemists thought that working with some elements should require some planets to be in line with themselves. And astrology is not viewed as something occult in Middle Ages. There are a lot of astrologists in courts of medieval kings and so on. It's quite common practice. If we're talking about something more specific, for example, this steps of processes that are depicted in medieval manuscripts. There is some how to say, there are some images that repeat themselves. So looking at more ancient manuscripts, we could try to see the same patterns and see like this image goes after this image and after this image, and it repeats in different sources. So we could compare it and see it as a depiction of some chemical processes, for example. I think that's the key to. But when we try to decipher what processes there were, that's the difficulty of it, because we could guess it, or for example compare it to modern chemistry and see what could be done here, but it's not clear at all. And I think that's the problem which scholars have with the alchemy, and that's why there to this day are a lot of studies that are written not by historians or historians that study culture and so on, but by people who pretend to know some secret knowledge, and to decipher this, because we still are not fully able to decipher most of it, just because this secret recipe of alchemist community died out with the practice itself in the Middle Ages. So I guess this keys to the imagery would be told from master to apprentice, from teacher to the student, and would not be written down, unfortunately.
That is a shame. And I see what you mean, that I think I have found sort of throughout certainly my own studies that anything that's a little bit secretive tends to generate enormous amounts of kind of speculation and, dare I say, even like pseudoscience and pseudo history, that I think you pointed out there. And I think it's fascinating how I imagine it's an extraordinary opportunity, but also incredibly frustrating when you've got these sources that have all kinds of weird and wonderful things going on, but it's not always immediately obvious what they're trying to convey, because, as you pointed out there, of course, they wouldn't have written down their secrets. They would have kept it very much to themselves.
Yeah.
And I suppose that leads me on to perhaps a follow-up question for that. I think, sort of as you've already touched on, I think alchemy continues to have a massive impact on the human psyche, even though, we live in an age of modern, rational, empirical science. I was really interested with some of the initial scholars that you talked about, that some of them didn't necessarily approach alchemy from a purely historical perspective. They seemed to be kind of trained in other disciplines. So I suppose my second question would be, why do you think alchemy continues to kind of capture the human imagination, even centuries after it's been sort of discontinued as a legitimate practice.
Yeah, that's also a big and enormous question in itself. Through the 19th century, it was more like more marginal interest. For example, there were figures like Eliphas Levi who were interested in tarot and some occult practices, and they would speculate about alchemy and what it means. The big interest, I would say, were in the late 19th and early 20th century. There were in Britain there were this occult order. I don't know how really to spell it out. Like this secret community. So there was the priest and so on. They pretended to be Rosencrantzian, not really, because Rosencrantzians is the secret society from 16th century, and from this order, I forgot its name, unfortunately, generated Aleister Crowley, the infamous occultist of the 20th century, and at the same time, in Germany and in Austria, there was an interest generated by Carl Gustav Jung, who wrote a whole book, Psychology and Alchemy, and I think that that was a step away from his teacher Freud, who studied dreams as his material. Also very unusual kind of sphere. And Jung proposed that this imagery is symbolical, and through it we could relive some spiritual journey. And Jung himself even practiced some kind of alchemy. He built himself a laboratory where he experimented. I don't know how it all ended, but he was quite interested in it. I think his interest was sparked not by occult itself, but by his interest in the East, because there were not just European tradition of alchemy, but also Chinese and Indian tradition of alchemy. And then he discovered this tradition in his own culture. So he thought that people could transform and could better themselves, could be in peace with their unconscious through these practices. If it's correct or not, it's a question that we couldn't prove or prove wrong, but that's his point of view. And I think that, as I said, that symbols live in our culture, and they transform, but they stay in some way. So they could change meaning, but they just try to exist further and further. And I think that's what provokes in us some answer to this bizarre but ancient imagery. That's what amazes us in some way. So it's something very profound, very multi-layered, and something ancient. And we could, in interpretation of it, we could find something that is closer to us. I think that's the kind of interest that we can see in this symbols and imagery.
Definitely. And I can imagine as well that the mixture of it perhaps being quite detached from our own time, and us maybe imposing our own contemporary ideas onto these symbols. And I think even the idea as well that I think what I can gather in a lot of alchemy, there's this sort of idea of trying to understand both the kind of natural and metaphysical world in one kind of neat package. I expect that something like that has massive appeal, either for, people trying to emulate these practices themselves in some kind of pseudo-scientific capacity, or somebody like, say, Jung and Freud, one of these kind of early psychologists, maybe trying to kind of pick apart sort of the minds of these people studying these things and getting to kind of dive into that. Do you think there's perhaps an element of that as well? Just the fact that this is perhaps detached enough from our time that we see this as a kind of ancient occult secret, and there are these kind of ways of trying to understand the broader world that, try to link everything together. Do you think that kind of garners an interest as well?
Yeah, obviously it is. As I said earlier, there was this Soviet, not Soviet, but more anti-Soviet publicist, Evgeny Golovin, who viewed this as some kind of counterculture to the Soviet reality, and it was like some other world that you could dive into, and it's not in any way connected to the mundane reality of nowadays. And I think, yeah, that's the big part of discourse about today's alchemy. For example, I've bought this translation of medieval manuscript, and I opened the commentary, and their author claimed to be a modern day alchemist, and there's a lot of it in the market. For example, there is this made up figure of early 20th century, Fulcanelli, who claimed that he can explain the mysteries of the cathedrals, and there is some cipher like in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, and it was made up by multiple authors, and they claimed that they met this man, that he's a real alchemist, that he doesn't age at all, and so on and so on. So there is the cloak of mystery. And even in my experience, I had multiple lections about alchemy online and in real life. And when I was speaking, when I was telling this lecture in online space in Russian, one guy after the lecture pretended to be some kind of an alchemist, and he contacted me and said, like, I have a lab, I have an experiments, I'm not your lecture was not like perfect, but you depicted pretty good picture, and I'm Orthodox. He's a Orthodox Christian, and he claims to. I didn't see his face or didn't know his name, but he claimed that he is some kind of modern day alchemist. I don't know how to comment on that, but that's how it goes. And I think there are a lot of people that see it as like something very exotic and something thrilling for them.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and I see what you mean. That it's something it's almost a sort of parallel to the kind of modern rational science, isn't it? And it's got that sort of, as you said, that sort of cloak of fantasy to it that kind of provides that kind of escapism and that kind of intrigue.
And I think that it even can show us something about modern science and modern rationality, that maybe what we lost, like some kind of critique of modern positive science. Like if we look at this and how people perceived reality in different era, we could see what we're maybe losing, where we could be just a little bit too dogmatic and so on. So it's always, as in traveling to other culture, it's always interesting to see how other people view the world, not just our perception.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's really fascinating stuff. Moving on then, I'm quite interested to know perhaps what the church kind of made of all of this. I recall certainly from earlier interviews about magic that it was often a very fine line that, certainly the spell casting and things, there was an idea that sometimes it could be good, it could be rationalized as a miracle or perhaps a more kind of rational practice. And other times it was seen as a cult and satanic and far away from the church. And often the line between the two is very blurred. Do you get that impression with alchemy as well? Or did the church sort of have maybe a different perspective on it?
It was different in different periods and in different contexts, I think. So many prominent figures in Christianity, in Western Christianity, were viewed as alchemists. For example, Thomas of Aquin. There are a lot of sources that are attributed to him. We don't know if he is the author, but or not. His teacher, Albert the Great, was considered an alchemist, and there were a lot of like legends about how he made a golem or so on, like some kind of a robot. Many monks were alchemists. Arnaldo da Villanova from Spain, and Roger Bacon, the most famous one. He was an alchemist, but he was also imprisoned for his studies. So in some ways, when some thinker was not appreciated by the church, she could view it as something prohibited. But generally, it was common. Like astrology, there were astrologists and alchemists in the courts of the medieval kings, and even in like 17th century, when there were Reformation and Inquisition was much harsher than in more earlier periods. I think alchemy was quite common, and just in some cases when, for example, when alchemists claimed to have the secret of transmutation, of transformation of metals, and he didn't execute it, he didn't show it, he could be prosecuted, he could be imprisoned. But in other cases, it was quite common, and the number of sources that are left shows us that it's not viewed as something evil. I don't think that there are so many sources on black magic or something like that. It was more viewed as something malevolent.
See, that's really fascinating. As my initial assumption would have been that it would have been perhaps seen as a more grey practice, for want of a better phrase. But it's really interesting that, as you said, even like monks and theologians were seen as alchemists in themselves. And I guess that kind of ties back to what you earlier said about perhaps inner alchemy and uniting opposites to edify the spirit. And I suppose just off the back of that, would that imply perhaps that alchemy could be practiced at different kind of levels of kind of intellectual and class understanding? Or was it more the preserve of like sort of quite educated people?
We don't really know, because there are no like autobiographies or some kind of letters about it. We don't have like the experience of people who practiced alchemy. There are different like legends. For example, there is this Liber Mutus, the Nam book, about that there is a legend about that Nicola Flamel, Parisian pharmacist, found this book and discovered the secret of Philosopher's Stone and become rich. But mostly the alchemists are the people in some kind tied up to the chemistry, for example, pharmacists, or monks and people, literate people who could read philosophers like Plato and so on, and derived from that. So I couldn't say if there were like people from lower classes, but monasteries itself, it wasn't like some institution for upper class. It was an opportunity for talented people from more poor groups to rise up to the top. And also there is it's not tied up with the alchemy, more with the magic, but there is the legend of Pope Sylvesterus, who obtained some kind of magic source of information and rose up to become a pope. So I think this beautiful picture of how monasteries and this infrastructure were viewed in Middle Ages.
I see. That's absolutely fascinating. I think that's something which I'll have to look up myself afterwards. Pope Sylvester and his rise to power.
Yeah, there were legends like he sold his spirit to devil, or he invented some kind of like also a golem, some kind of robot who gave him the right answers to every question, and so that's how he became a pope, not because of his talents and so on.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid we're starting to come to the end of our interview. I have one last question for you, if that's okay. If anybody would be interested to dive more into this topic or to learn more, are there any books or resources that you'd recommend?
That's also a hard question because, yeah, as I said, a lot of sources are more speculative. So if you're interested in like psychological aspects, there is the Carl Gustav Jung and his Psychology and Alchemy, and there is his student Marie-Louise von France, who also wrote a lot about alchemy. I was more founded in the Russian sources because it's my native language. So, but I think there is a book about Renaissance magic and how it was reinvented in the Renaissance. Culiano, I think, is the author of it. And I really don't know about further literature, but I think if you're looking into alchemy, the recipes not to avoid more popular, more speculative literature, and to look into the authors more rooted in the history or history of culture. I've also consulted this article about visual representation of these ideas. I think it's not, it's American author, I guess. So that's all I could say. I couldn't recommend Russian literature. Unfortunately, it's not been translated to English yet. I hope that some authors would be known in some time in English sphere too.
Yeah, hopefully so. Pavel, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and thank you for an amazing presentation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Good stuff. And to everybody watching, thank you very much, and hope to see you in the next episode. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.